And I do think at least on the more literary side of the market, that there is a huge investment in the print as this like art object, and print on demand. The values of that, it's the fast fashion thing. We want something that has been this bespoke artisanal book. We don't want the fast fashion book.
We're not publishing genre fiction here.
Right.
Everybody just needs to get over themselves.
Hi, I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 28 years.
I'm Ellie Blue, the Vice President of Microcosm. We started this podcast to share what we've learned with newer publishers, so you can learn from our mistakes. Or maybe you just want to learn about the publishing industry.
This week, we welcome back special guest to the pod, Jane Friedman of the Hot Sheet, to debunk yet another popular myth within publishing. We don't always debunk myths with Jane, but sometimes we answer author questions. But this time, it's the question people should have asked that we're going to answer, which is, there's been a lot of hubbub this year, especially these last 4 months, about print-on-demand books. Ellie and I went to Boswell's in Milwaukee on one of the Heartland tours, and we were a little surprised, like just how many books in the store were on POD supplemental, because presumably, well, who could speculate as to why, but you can tell the difference is like a big thing. And so there was dare I call it, a think piece about tearing down POD, and they called it the fast fashion of books, which is a pretty good burn, but it isn't really applicable. It doesn't actually trace. And then lots of response pieces, but it's kind of like everybody has an opinion, but nobody kind of wants to look at the facts. So what are the facts, Jane?
Well, your opinion.
I mean, you guys are probably far closer to this than I am, because you have to deal, I imagine, with POD printers at some point. Do you not at all? Really? That's amazing. Okay. So, I mean, the LitHub piece was really, I mean, it was kind of, in some ways, talking out both sides of its mouth, because it was acknowledging that small presses and others that really rely on POD, of course, it's okay for them to use it. But if the big publishers use it, bad. And which really kind of rubbed me the wrong way, because POD is just a tool. I don't like the moralizing that's done around it. I think it has a purpose in all types of publishing. And then obviously it's been fundamental for self-publishing authors. They wouldn't be able to sell print copies in many cases unless there's somehow, because they don't have the money to do a print run, right? So when I myself wrote about this issue, I tried to explain that POD doesn't automatically mean low quality, but it can end up producing a low quality book because people aren't thoughtful or careful in the process. There are lots of reasons we could talk about why POD doesn't measure up. But one thing I don't think is commonly known by authors is that, and this happened at the traditional publishing house I worked at, after the first print run sells out, and this is offset printing where, it's the higher quality printing. Often when you go back to press, you're taking away some of those more expensive operations. It could be a cover gloss. It could be like a special sort of binding, whatever. I remember we did a book called Writer's Paris that was like a linen, like a kind of a bendy linen cover with a belly band, which I was given hell for by the production people. It's going to tear. We're going to get returns. So many damaged books are going to come back. But when that book went back to press, it was not done that way. It was done as a standard paperback. So that's a really extreme example, but publishers often go back to press and then decrease the quality after that first edition or first printing has gone out. And certainly when you go into paperback from hardcover, obviously that's already happening on one level, but you may go to POD just to save yourself on costs or inventory, other issues related to stock. Not always, publishers don't automatically do this, but I have seen certainly some disappointing examples of publishers transitioning to POD for a book, and they haven't done like just really logical things. Like if the original cover did have a spot gloss or something that helped the author name stand out, if that's taken away on the POD and the author name blurs in with everything else, you obviously need to make some changes. So I think something that's been pressuring publishers, one of the reasons we're seeing more POD on the market, generally speaking, is because of issues in the supply chain. Has to do with paper, printing, even ink. There's just been a lot of, and this goes beyond the pandemic, there are just a lot of changes going on in the paper market generally that are much bigger than the book publishing industry. So publishers don't always have the materials they need or want. That's even true for POD. You might not have the materials you need or want. And also POD isn't always going to be able to replicate the trim size or the paper quality that you had on the offset printing. So publishers have been pressured by all sorts of people throughout the supply chain to standardize. Don't use that really unique trim for just that book. Why don't you choose a trim that can be replicated in POD? So there's definitely ways to make sure that the POD is less different, less obviously different. It can be high quality. And so I think the people who were speaking out against that piece were saying, look, don't blame POD. It has advanced a lot in the last 20 to 30 years. And it's really about doing it properly and not half-assing it, which sadly some publishers do half-ass it. So that's my position.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, to like, the context I can provide is I am the Jane in this situation at Microcosm, where I had production flourishes where the salespeople or the warehouse people are like, "You're just bringing in damages. You're
right."
Complaint customer service is like, this great box that you created is getting complaints, but it's like. So, I mean, and I guess from all the information that you're providing here, I would blame the production departments at these presses, because it's like you have to make certain changes to have something show up well, especially, so when we do a reprint, we'll normally go to a 45-pound alternative cream paper. So it's like, it's a thicker stock, but it's lightweight. So that, and by incredible dumb luck, and I do mean that in all earnestness, that was one of the few papers that didn't go up 20% in price over the last 4 years. Yeah. So we were largely immune from that until the like rare moment when we do a 4-color book on white paper, and they're like, we can't run it on your 45-pound because it won't dry. And so things like that, but especially on a cover, especially, if you take away a spot gloss or something that is like creating the effect, that's more what we're seeing too, where it's like, oh, they didn't think through this, or maybe the person that designed it didn't get to adjust it for POD because it was designed for 3 spot. I mean, and I design covers all the time that are like 4 spot colors, like and that would not work. It would just look like mud if it was rough in, Right. So you understand production. So that's great. Well,
I should say my husband was a production editor manager for 20 years. So a lot of what I know is actually because of him.
Right. But that's great. And so a lot of people don't know that. They just look at the book and they're like, oh, it looks crappy. POD must be the problem.
Right.
I do feel like, though, you can tell the difference. I feel like a small voice in the darkness here. You can tell the difference. And personally, I'm never thrilled when I'm picking up a book at a bookstore and it's POD. Like, it's, just maybe that's me being snobbish. And I try to remind myself that you can also have like crappy print quality on offset print runs too. Like, you can also like have decisions made in production that don't translate to print. It's all, I don't know. You two are bringing me around a little bit, because I definitely came into this being like, I still don't like POD, but now I'm like, I guess it's a matter of like knowing the tools. So I guess in that way, POD isn't necessarily as democratizing as people are necessarily making it out to be. And I mean, as a
former publisher with zero resources, you can afford a print run. Like, you can raise the money on Kickstarter. You can do things. You can make your print runs very modest. I don't think that people have to publish POD and when they don't have capital going in. So I just wanted to like plant my flag there. You can do it. You don't have to do it that way. And like the POD companies, I don't know, they're not all big companies owned by billionaires, but the main ones are. The ones that you're going to run into are.
Well, I should add one option that's often overlooked, and someone actually commented on an article I wrote pointing this out. There's such a thing as a digital short run that's kind of like, so kind of meeting in the middle. So it does offer you higher quality, but you don't have to print in high quantities. So it's usually used for print runs somewhere from a few dozen to several hundred. And so that's another option if you're trying, like I think a lot of people would not, including myself, I don't know if you'd be able to tell a digital short run from an offset, depending on what, I mean, for a 4-color book, sure, but for a black and white, probably not. So there's always that option as well. I think for self-publishers where, and I don't mean publishing companies, but self-publishing authors, one of the reasons they're kind of led down the POD path to begin with is because it's not just about printing, it also becomes about distribution. And if you want to be able to sell in a streamlined way to the major places, at least in the US. So, and I have heard really just awful stories about actually not a decline in quality from Amazon, which is where I would more expect it from, but from Ingram. Like examples of getting like a case of books and all of the covers are crooked or have been trimmed improperly, which they will refund. But, you know, working with Ingram is time consuming. Their customer service, sadly, has dropped off a cliff. It just takes weeks to hear back from them. So I really feel for authors, and I can see why POD can get this really bad association, because you're dealing with these two companies that I'm not sure how much they care about what they're producing. It is very impersonal and widget-like.
I mean, definitely, like, you know, when we print 5,000 copies of something, some percentage of them are going to have wonky covers, are going to have like a weird, like, color saturation, maybe a weird trim thing going on. And I guess like that's also happening with the POD companies. And if your print run of 20 copies happens to be the like 0.01% that was messed up that day, that's all you,
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking about it too, where like I hear about it from smaller presses, smaller, or, you know, published authors too all the time, because they're like, all of my books were bound upside down, my cover was bound on somebody else's book, things like, you know, and for them, this is like, you know, this is their baby. So it's not just like the customer service issue, it's like heartbreaking, because they're like, why do they not care like I care? You know?
But it's also like on demand, so you're getting it for a purpose that you like probably need it for then, not when it gets fixed.
Yeah. And true story, we used print on demand lately for 2 or 3 years in our 28 plus year history, because it was recommended to us when we worked with Ingram. And then one day when we made the reorder, we just got an error on checkout. It wouldn't let us check out. And so when I contacted customer service, I never heard back. And then we just stopped using it. And then we're like, okay, well, it's more expensive anyway, so let's cut it out of our pipeline. And then we rebuilt our software so it does print run management. So now we don't ever need to do that, because we plan it from the get. So we won't ever have that sort of situation where there's cases where we will print 2,000 and be like, okay, that's going to situate us a while. But one of those books, we just went through them all. So we're like, oh, okay. And the other thing that's kind of weird and interesting is, and maybe to this timely, weird moment we're living in where people are becoming political about print on demand, maybe the fact that like the books look a little nicer is what took what should have been a 7-year supply and sold it out in 4 years. So, you know, give or take. So like 4 years isn't a lot of investment for inventory, But on the other hand, we sold it all. So
Yeah. I'll just offer a bit of pragmatic advice for those who are having to deal, authors who are having to deal with Ingram Spark or Amazon. If you are ordering like a case of books for an event, or there's something timely going on and you don't want to get caught with bad quality books, I would say there's no reason you have to print through those two companies for just those, for like event needs or direct sales. You can send those printer files to a POD printer or a digital printer like Book Vault, Snowfall Press, Print Ninja. There are so many you could go choose from, and you'll get a more personalized experience, and the cost will be equivalent. So I would say once you reach that 20 copy threshold, maybe you shouldn't print through those two places unless you just have a really good reason to.
Yeah, or you get a better level of service, or So and it's interesting that this became, and like it feels snobbish in a weird way when like, as you both pointed out, like for a lot of people this is their like vital pipeline. But I guess thoughts on that?
I think I missed the question in there.
Like why? I mean, books have a tendency to kind of make anything snobbish.
Oh,
Why? What do you think makes it where people kind of can turn up their nose at this technology?
I mean, I think part of it is the long time association that POD has had with self-publishing. I mean, that's how at least I started in the industry almost at the exact moment that POD printing was becoming prevalent. And when you had companies like Ex Libris, iUniverse, and others, basically, I remember a time when they didn't even charge writers for the service. You could just send in your files and they would give you a book. They would do all the cover design, interior design for free, because this was considered the future, print on demand. And so much of that, I mean, the market got flooded with these really low quality books because that's print on demand just it did not look good at that time. I remember how like the lamination on the covers would actually peel off. And the books would curl as well because the paper hadn't been cut the correct way. So I think people have not forgotten that. That's my guess.
Yeah.
I've been on panels where I've had to explain that something is a hinge score on a POD book, and that is not a manufacturing defect because the bias is so hard from the older people, who witnessed it through the dawn of the technology. That's a good point too. So it's like, like shout out to our self-publishing brethren, like, the bias against you is real. Like, people are weird about that. That's something that like industry people never really got over.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub.
On Twitter at Microcosm.
On Facebook at Microcosm Publishing.
On Instagram at Microcosm_pub.
And here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.